Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Ignition Time. I have done another video on our channel exploring as to whether the US economy is headed for a recession. Well folks, one thing is for sure, the economy is definitely going to slow down. Here's a headline of an article on your screen from the Wall Street Journal. The US economy grows as the fourth quarter GDP, gross domestic product, shows strongest year in decades. In fact, economists expect growth to slow down this year in 2022 because of weaker consumer spending and supply chain shortages. So folks, what exactly is going on? The US economy grew rapidly in the last quarter of 2021, advancing to a 6.9% annual rate. Basically, this was the strongest year of growth in nearly 40 years as we recovered from the recession. But the problem is this growth is indeed going to run into obstacles that will slow down the recovery this year. The gross domestic product, which again is simply a measure of goods and services bought and sold. In other words, are people actually going out there and spending money? Do people have jobs? Is money moving through the economy? The gross domestic product in the last quarter of 2021 actually moved up from the third quarter's growth rate of 2.3%, which basically means that we were doing a lot more spending in the fourth quarter, which by the way makes sense because of the holidays. The bottom line is there was a lot of spending from households and a lot of stores were actually able to sell stuff. Now, the output actually grew in 2021 when compared to the fourth quarter of 2020, which makes sense because for the most part, almost everything was shut down in 2020. So this is good for President Biden. He can brag about it, but the fact is many of our fellow Americans are still extremely pessimistic. In fact, the economy has not grown this fast since 1984 during President Ronald Reagan's first term when the country was rebounding from a double-dip recession and a period of high inflation. According to Beth Ann Bovino, who's a chief U.S. economist at S&P Global Ratings, the U.S. has learned to adapt to the new world of variance and continues to produce. Let's take a look at this chart on your screen, which shows you the contributions to 2021 GDP and the annual change in percentage points. You'll see that services like housing and utilities, healthcare, transportation, recreation, food services actually led to a reduction in gross domestic product. But on the other hand, people started to spend money on food and beverages, on clothing, on gas, on business investments, change in private inventories. In other words, people were starting to buy stuff and a lot of businesses were starting to stock up on inventory, residential investments, all of these things were starting to go up. Now, there are some warning signs on the other hand though. The warning signs are that most of the growth was a direct result of companies restocking rather than more and more people actually buying stuff. Now, this is an area of concern because yes, people did spend in the last quarter of 2021, but a lot of companies were restocking because they basically hadn't bought a lot of stuff in 2020 and the first half of 2021. So in part, the rise in the investment in inventory was basically a rebound from super low inventory during the summer. Now, Americans didn't spend as much, which again is another concern, and that was related directly to the Omicron variant. There was a new wave of infections and inflation cut into the paychecks of the average American. Here's a quote from Andrew Hunter, who's a chief US economist at the research firm Capital Economics. The headline 6.9% figure is probably a bit overly optimistic assessment of the underlying strength of demand. We do think it's increasingly the case that the economy is essentially at or rapidly approaching that capacity constrained potential level. The speed limit is lower now than it was prior to the pandemic. So, folks, as you know, last year we had an expansion because of all the stimulus money that came in from all the stimulus checks that we got, all the unemployment benefits. Now, households have spent a significant portion of that money, and now that the Federal Reserve is about to raise interest rates, I can tell you that it's going to be more expensive to borrow money. Credit card interest rates are going to go up, and it's likely that spending will actually slow down. In fact, the Federal Reserve said this in a written statement. The path of the economy continues to depend on the course of the virus. Progress on vaccinations and an easing of supply constraints are expected to support continued gains in economic activity and employment, as well as a reduction in inflation. Risks to the economic outlook remain, including from new variants of the virus. So basically, there's still a lot of concern about what the virus could do because we still haven't completely recovered from the pandemic. But the bottom line is we are slowly as a country starting to recover. In fact, businesses are not only struggling to get goods to make products, they also need people, and a majority of the US workforce has indeed come back to work, but there are still several million jobs that are still open because a lot of people have not come back to work. So what is the bottom line, everyone? The bottom line is we will continue to recover in 2022, but at a very slow, gradual pace. This means that the recovery will be much slower in 2022 compared to 2021, and we are likely to see a reduction in demand, reduced consumer spending, which, by the way, is what drives the economy. Will we slip into a recession? I personally don't think so, but one thing is for sure, the US economy will slow down in 2022. Here's a chart on your screen that shows you the US GDP percentage change from the same period a year earlier. You'll start to see in 2020, there was a substantial reduction. In 2021, there was a big rebound, and now things are starting to cool off, and we'll start to see those gray bars come back to essentially a baseline like it was prior to the pandemic. In other words, relative to where we are now, the US economy will cool off and things will cool down. Now, how does this impact you? I believe that the US economy cooling off could end up being a good thing in some ways, because that means things are not going to be as expensive. When demand goes down and supply keeps up, then prices go down. In other words, things should start to get better. I believe that when the economy slows down, it's actually going to be good for the middle class American, because that means milk, eggs will get cheaper. That means it'll be less expensive to fill up gas at the gas station. And I think that all this inflation that's eating into our paychecks will indeed subside. And that is my assessment. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think of the massive growth in the US economy in the fourth quarter of 2021, but the reduction that is expected in 2022 as a direct result of weaker consumer spending and persistent supply chain shortages. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Dr. Nitin Chhoda with Ignition Time. Please click the like button. Please click subscribe. Please enable notifications. I appreciate you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode of Ignition Time. Take care. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.